Two men sat down in a single room in 1822. When they walked out, the dream of one united Latin America was already dying. They had freed half a continent between them. They had crossed mountains nobody thought could be crossed. They had armies, glory, and a shared enemy. And in less than 4 hours of private conversation, they threw it all away. One of them sailed off into exile that same night, broken and silent. The other marched south to finish the war alone, only to watch his life's work crumble 8 years later. He died bankrupt, coughing blood, whispering that everything he had built was as useless as plowing the sea. This is the story of how 400 million people who share a language, a religion, and 300 years of history ended up split into 20 different countries. People who had more in common than the 13 American colonies that became the United States. People who almost became something bigger than Europe. And then didn't. The tragedy isn't that Latin America was conquered. The tragedy is that it was free. Briefly, gloriously, completely free. And the men who freed it could not stand to share a room with each other. To understand how it all fell apart, we have to go back. Back to the empire that held the entire continent together for 300 years. Back to a system so unfair it sounds invented. Back to the moment a short French emperor accidentally lit a fuse he did not know he was lighting. That empire was Spain. And in 1808, Spain was about to lose everything. Spain's empire was enormous. For 3 centuries, they controlled everything from Mexico to the southern tip of Argentina. Laid out on a map, it dwarfed all of Europe combined. And they tried to run the entire thing from one city, Madrid, thousands of miles away across the Atlantic. A letter sent from Buenos Aires to Madrid took 3 months by ship. A reply took another 3 months. Try running a continent with a 6-month conversation delay. But the distance was not even the worst part. Spain had a rule so absurd it sounded made up by someone trying to start a war. If you were born in Spain and moved to the Americas, every top job in the colonies was open to you. Governor, judge, general, bishop, anything. But if your parents were Spanish and you happened to be born in the Americas, you were called a criollo, and criollos were treated as second class for life. You could own half the countryside. You could have more silver than the king himself. But because you were born on the wrong continent, you could never hold real power. And every ship from Spain brought another fresh-faced stranger who outranked you the moment his boots touched the dock. Imagine spending 200 years building your family's name in a place, only to bow to some pale-faced bureaucrat who got seasick on the way over. The criollos seethed. They drank in private houses and whispered about it. They read forbidden books about a place called the United States, where farmers with muskets had somehow beaten the British Empire. And they wondered, quietly, why not us? In a private house in Bogota, a group of criollos gathered around a candlelit table. One of them pulled out a battered book about the American Revolution and slid it into the middle of the cloth. He jabbed a finger at a page describing Yorktown. "They did it," he whispered. "If farmers with muskets can beat the British Empire, what is stopping us?" The room went quiet. Nobody answered, but nobody disagreed either. Scenes like this were happening everywhere. In Caracas, in Buenos Aires, in Santiago, in Mexico City. Men with money, men with land, men with grudges that stretched back generations. All reading the same forbidden pages and asking the same forbidden question. Spain's empire looked solid on the surface. Underneath, millions of furious criollos were doing the actual work, while strangers from across the ocean collected the salary. The anger built for decades, and then in 1808, a very short French emperor accidentally set the whole continent on fire. Napoleon Bonaparte already controlled most of Europe. He decided he wanted Spain too. His plan was so sneaky, it sounded like something out of a cartoon. He invited the Spanish king to a friendly meeting in France. The king packed his bags, expecting a pleasant chat. Instead, Napoleon threw him in a French prison and put his own brother Joseph on the Spanish throne. Just like that, Spain belonged to the Bonaparte family. The news took weeks to reach the Americas. When it finally arrived, the criollos found themselves holding a very interesting question. If their king was rotting in a French cell, exactly whose orders were they supposed to be taking now? Nobody had a good answer. The criollos found their answer fast, and it was beautiful in its sneakiness. They would set up their own local councils, called juntas, to run things in the name of the imprisoned king. Technically, they were not rebels. They were loyal subjects keeping the chair warm until the real king came home. In practice, they were kicking Spanish officials out of every government building they could find. What is genuinely strange is that every criollo on the continent landed on the exact same idea at almost the exact same moment. There was no internet, no telegraph, no shared meeting. Just a continent full of frustrated men reading the same news and reaching the same conclusion within weeks of each other. In a warehouse in Caracas, a local merchant heard about the king's capture and walked straight to his back room. He pulled a dusty tarp off a pile of muskets he had been quietly collecting for years and started handing them to his neighbors. For the king, he told each one with a wink. Nobody asked which king he meant. Within months, juntas had popped up across the continent. Buenos Aires, Bogota, Caracas, Santiago, Quito, La Paz. At first, they all insisted they were just minding the shop until the real king came back. But once they got a taste of running their own affairs, of writing their own laws, of keeping their own taxes, the idea of handing it all back to Spain started feeling less and less appealing. The revolution had begun across an entire continent, and these brand new governments were about to do something nobody saw coming. They were about to turn on each other. Buenos Aires, the biggest and richest city in the south, immediately declared itself the leader of the entire region. They wanted every nearby territory to join their new government and take orders from their capital. Paraguay, the smaller territory right next door, took one look at that arrangement and said absolutely not. Buenos Aires did not handle rejection well. In 1811, they sent an entire army marching north into Paraguay to force them to join up at sword point. Think about that for a moment. They had not even finished fighting Spain yet, and they were already invading their neighbors. Paraguay's army met them in the field, defeated them, and sent them limping back home. The dream of a united South was dead before it ever really started. Up north, things went even worse. Venezuela proudly declared independence in 1811. Then, in March 1812, a massive earthquake ripped through Caracas and killed thousands of people in seconds. Buildings collapsed, churches crumbled, families were buried under stone in the middle of Mass. In a wrecked church outside the city, a priest who still supported Spain climbed onto a pile of broken stones and pointed at the sky. God is angry, he shouted at a crowd of terrified survivors covered in dust. You turned against your king, and this is what happens. Enough people were already scared and grieving and desperate for an explanation. They believed him. Soldiers deserted their posts. Whole towns switched sides overnight. Venezuela's revolution collapsed almost without a fight. The first wave of independence was already crumbling, and Spain had barely started pushing back. The worst was still coming. In 1814, the real king came home. Napoleon was finally defeated in Europe, and the Spanish king walked out of his French prison and straight back onto his throne. He grabbed his crown, looked across the ocean at the chaos in his colonies, and did exactly what you would expect. He sent warships, lots of them, loaded with experienced soldiers who had just spent years fighting the French and were very, very good at killing people. By 1815, the empire had struck back hard. Spain had retaken Venezuela, Colombia, and Chile. Mexico was still bleeding from a failed uprising. Buenos Aires and stubborn little Paraguay were the only places still free of Spanish control, and they refused to cooperate with each other. The whole revolution looked dead and buried. Across the continent, men who had dared to dream were back to bowing to officials from Madrid. But on opposite ends of South America, two men were quietly cooking up the most ridiculous military plan anyone had ever heard. From the south came José de San Martín, a quiet Argentine general who had actually spent years fighting inside Spain's own army before switching sides. He was disciplined, methodical, and almost painfully modest. He did not give speeches, he did not seek glory. He just planned. From the north came Simón Bolívar, a wealthy Venezuelan who talked big, dressed flashy, and had already led two revolutions in his home country. Both had ended in disaster, and both times he had been chased into exile. He was brilliant, charismatic, and absolutely convinced of his own destiny. The two men did not know each other. They were thousands of miles apart, and somehow, independently, they came up with the exact same impossible idea: drag an entire army over the Andes Mountains. The Andes are the spine of South America, a massive wall of stone running down the entire west side of the continent, taller than anything in Europe, frozen at the top year-round, air so thin that men collapse just walking, never mind hauling cannons. Even today, people die crossing certain passes on a clear summer day, but the Spanish armies were camped on the other side, fat and comfortable, certain that no sane commander would ever come at them over the roof of the world. And that was exactly the point. The Spanish would never expect it. So San Martin and Bolivar, separately, on opposite sides of the continent, decided to do the thing nobody would expect. Somewhere high in a frozen pass, one of San Martin's mules carrying two cannons decided it had seen enough. It sat down in the snow and refused to move. Three soldiers pushed from behind. Two pulled from the front. One tried reasoning with it in increasingly desperate Spanish. The mule just stared at them with the dead-eyed contempt that only a mule can produce. Eventually, the men unloaded one of the cannons and carried it themselves on numb shoulders. The mule casually stood up and kept walking, lighter and clearly pleased with itself. In January 1817, San Martin crossed the Andes with around 5,000 soldiers, hauling cannons through passes above 10,000 feet. When his army came crashing down the western slopes into Chile, the Spanish garrisons were completely stunned. He defeated them in battle, freed the country, and kept marching north toward Peru, the heart of Spanish power on the continent. Bolívar pulled off a similar miracle from the north. He marched his army through flooded jungle plains where soldiers stood chest-deep in muddy water for days, holding their muskets above their heads to keep the powder dry. Then up through frozen mountain passes into Colombia, where men froze to death in their sleep. When his ragged, half-dead army stumbled down the eastern slopes, the Spanish were just as stunned as their colleagues to the south had been. He smashed them in battle and freed the country. Then Bolivar did something nobody else had thought to do. He convinced the leaders of Venezuela, Colombia, and Ecuador that they would be stronger together than apart. He merged all three into one massive nation and called it Gran Colombia, with its capital in Bogota. For a brief, shining moment, it looked like the dream was actually working. One huge country, one flag, one people, the biggest force in South America. Two men had freed half a continent between them. Now they just needed to finish the job and decide what to do with it. And that was where everything started to fall apart. In July 1822, the two greatest heroes of the revolution finally met face to face in Guayaquil, a steamy port city on the coast of Ecuador. But Bolivar had pulled a fast one. He had arrived weeks earlier and quietly filled the city with his own soldiers, his own flags, his own officials. By the time San Martin's ship pulled into the harbor, the place already looked like Bolivar's personal kingdom. The quiet general from the south stepped off the boat and realized he had walked straight into a trap. They shook hands, exchanged polite hellos in front of the crowds, and then disappeared into a private room. Just the two of them. No advisors, no secretaries, nobody taking notes. The door closed, and history closed with it. To this day, nobody knows exactly what was said inside that room, but we can piece together the basics from letters written later. San Martin believed the continent should be governed by a constitutional monarchy. A European prince brought in from the outside, neutral, with no ties to any local faction. Someone every country could accept without feeling subordinate to a neighbor. Bolívar found the idea offensive. They had spent 15 years kicking Europeans out. He wanted a republic. Specifically, a republic led by him. San Martin offered a compromise. Give him reinforcements, and together they would finish liberating Peru, the last Spanish stronghold. Or, if Bolívar preferred, San Martin would serve under him as a subordinate officer. He just wanted to help finish the war. Bolívar refused. He worked best alone. He did not share command. He did not share glory. San Martin walked out of that room a broken man. He had freed Argentina. He had liberated Chile. He had taken half of Peru. And the only other man on the continent capable of helping him finish the job had just told him politely to leave. That evening, a harbor worker in Guayaquil watched a tired-looking man in a plain coat board a small ship in the dark. No flags, no cheering crowd, no military escort, just one man with a single bag climbing aboard alone. He had no idea he was watching one of the greatest generals in history leaving South America forever. San Martin sailed to France and lived out his days in quiet exile, never speaking publicly about what happened in that room. Bolívar marched south, crushed Spain's last armies in Peru, and by 1825 had created a brand new country named after himself, Bolivia. He even wrote its first constitution by hand. Spain's 300-year grip on the Americas was finally broken. He had won everything he wanted. The peace lasted exactly 2 years. Venezuela wanted out of Gran Colombia. Then Ecuador, then Bolivia threw out the constitution he had personally written for them. Bolívar made the worst possible move and declared himself dictator, which only convinced everyone he had become the very thing they had fought against. By 1830, the man who had freed 6 countries was watching his masterpiece dissolve in real time. He was sick with tuberculosis, exhausted, nearly bankrupt, and heartbroken. He reportedly said that anyone who serves a revolution plows the sea, meaning all of it. The frozen mountains, the dead soldiers, the burned villages had been for nothing. He died in December 1830. By 1831, Gran Colombia had shattered into 3 countries. Central America split into 5. The tragedy was not that Latin America failed to unite. The tragedy was that it almost did. And the men who could have made it happen could not stand each other long enough to try. 400 million people, 1 language, 1 faith, 3 centuries of shared history, and 20 separate flags. All because of 1 closed door in a port city and 2 men who walked in as allies and walked out as strangers. If this story moved you, hit like, subscribe for more, and I will catch you next time.